At AmCham believe that extensive sustainability goals are key to success of every company and are key to the competitiveness of each country. At the EU, we have ambitious sustainability goals and a complex legal framework, and our task is to find the ways how to change our actions and deliver these ambitious goals. Here with us to discuss the European Green Deal and the competitive edge of sustainability are Dr. Martin Porter, Executive Chair at Brussels at the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership and Senior Advisor to CIG Europe, and Claudia Patricolo, Editor-in-Chief of the Sea Energy News. Mr. Porter has a long track record of working on industry, environment, and sustainability issues. He is also an expert advisor to the European Commission's Horizon 2020 on climate and resource issues, a representative on the Economic and Social Competitive Committee's Commission and Industrial Change, a member of UCL's European Institute Advisory Board, and a member of the Advisory Board to the Sustainable Biomass Program. Mrs. Patricolo, Mr. Porter, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. You can hear me? Okay. So thank you, Martin, for being here. Before we start our discussion, I would like to hear actually your thoughts about what we just heard from Mr. Ambassador. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it was very interesting to hear his thoughts immediately after President Zoltan's thought, actually. And one of the challenges is how to bring those two ideas and messages together, because they're not identical. And I think that's a really interesting context, if you want, for this discussion here today. Because as businesses, as members of AmCham, obviously all the companies here are trying to find the bridge, essentially, between the aspirations Zoltan set out and the practical day-to-day realities of making their businesses succeed and transforming the economy and our society as a consequence. So I was struck by the job of work we have to try and make sure that those two do converge. And there are, not unsurprisingly therefore, points that the ambassador said where I find myself in strong agreement, and others where I think he underplays some of the drivers and the context, but also the commercial opportunity that, and the business opportunity that comes from the transition that we are inevitably going through and are accelerating into as we speak. So I think the context is the European Green Deal, as he said, the zeitgeist, as he called it, I think, in Brussels and well beyond, including, obviously, in Hungary, I think, is more than a zeitgeist, I think. It's driven by drivers in the real physical world. The IPCC report that was published just a couple of days ago reminds us of how immediate that is and how the impacts are already being felt, and the fact that we have an unsustainable approach to our society, our economy at the moment. That will not disappear unless we change things. So that context, I think, is important to bear in mind when we're then addressing the day-to-day difficulties of negotiating a package as broad and complex as the European Green Deal is that he ran through in Brussels. But I think as well as that, the approach that he mentioned that the European Commission took upon taking office was even broader than the European Green Deal. The phrase which I have picked up on in the Commission's Sustainable Annual Growth Strategy, which informs its macroeconomic strategy, its political strategy for the European semester process, is competitive sustainability, within which the European Green Deal plays an important part. But it goes beyond, even in the scale that we see presented of the proposals that are being negotiated now. It goes well beyond that. It touches industrial strategy, competition policy, trade policy. It touches the strategy that we have for macroeconomic management, the euro and so on. it obviously touches on whole swathes of policies beyond those which he mentioned. And when we look at it in those terms, I think the Green Deal, even in its breadth and scope, is not the whole answer either, which sounds a bit daunting when we think of it like that. But it is for good reason that it is as broad as it is. The question I ask myself, and which I think is relevant to the ambassador, would be, if not this, then what else? What is the better version of what we are trying to achieve? It's not to say that his criticisms may also be correct in some cases, but we have to take on this challenge. And I think the challenge is best addressed, I think, as the President said, with a view of how we can make as much of that an opportunity and turn it into something beneficial, as much as look at the extent to which there are obviously challenges and costs and how to mitigate and minimize those, which we absolutely need to do.
But also we have to do it fast, and we have to do it together, because we are running out of time, sort of, and also President Sabo was mentioning that it's not a choice anymore, and we heard many times the European Commission saying that Europe alone cannot do it, because actually the emissions coming from the European Union are something like less than 10% of the global one. So it is important that we see other people, other countries on board. And we actually have seen that. We have seen the United States. We have seen sort of China to an extent. We are looking at companies joining also this climate neutrality race. We are looking at startups. We are looking at individuals. So individually, we know more or less where to go, how to do that. But can we do it together also? Because you mentioned competitive sustainability now, so I would like to understand what's the meaning of that, and if you also could explain the audience about that.
Yes, well, I think the competitive sustainability is the flip side to collaborative sustainability. And we see collaborative sustainability at a global level through the Paris Agreement, for example, and other international approaches designed to enable countries, and obviously therefore companies, to collaborate and work towards common goals. How we are then able to implement that, because as you quite rightly say, Hungary, the European Union, is a small part of a global process in the end, is a very important strategic question. The answer that the European Union has at the moment is that to shape the rest of the world's answers, there needs to be a leadership role, essentially, a front-runner role played by the European Union, by its businesses, by the diplomats, but also by us as individuals. Because if they don't see that, they will be slower. They will take decisions later than they would have to. They will change their economic models. Their business will adapt differently. So the strategic question for competitive sustainability is how to do that and succeed and demonstrate that there are benefits, there are opportunities, there are new markets, all the things that I guess your companies in this room are wrestling with and trying to understand how to create. And what is the role, therefore, that from a governmental policy perspective, how does policy enable and enhance that, but without undermining the collaborative sustainability which
yeah, exactly, because
works.
what you say, I also think, when I hear the word competitive, I actually think about workplaces. Like, you're not competitive enough, or you're too much competitive, or you need to be ahead of your competitors. So like that, we don't have to risk to leave somebody behind, which is against what the European Commission is saying with the just transition.
Well, I think the risk is obviously that we fail to achieve ultimately the type of goals set out in the Paris Agreement or other environmental agreements. But within those global agreements, the key ingredient is that there are common goals and differentiated approaches by region, by country, and obviously when you come to an individual country, that will be by community as well. There will be communities affected more deeply than others by the sorts of changes that we will see here. So there is obviously a role, therefore, for governments to target some of the management of that transition to particular communities. And here, again, I would agree with the ambassador. There are risks in the extension of the ETS to certain communities. And that was something that the group I advise, CLG Europe, as well as CISL, has pointed out from the start. It's a very difficult
But what risks, for example?
The risks, as the ambassador said, that there will be individuals, poorer, more vulnerable communities, consumers, who will be asked to pay higher prices than would otherwise be the case, and they will react badly to that.
So how all of this can coexist now? Because right now we already have higher energy prices. So how do we make competitive sustainability live with high energy prices?
Well, energy is obviously a very important part of this equation, and I think the transition to a new form of energy system has investment costs, and very significant investment costs, but those investment costs bring down the price of the alternative or newer energies at the same time as being a high upfront cost. So we will see, and we are seeing over time already, the price of certain new energies, if you want, clean energies, rapidly diminishing, whilst obviously there will be high ongoing prices for others, increased by the uncertainty and the difficulties that are posed, for example, by Ukraine, but not only. Mm-hmm. So we're in a transition. The transition will be unpredictable, it'll be messy, it'll be hard to manage, but the price of energy isn't necessarily going to go up and only in one direction for all types of energy. But it can result in some communities, some users of energy being particularly exposed, and that is exactly where the role of government becomes very important.
So do you think we are ready to actually sacrifice something, as the president was also saying, well, the CEO was also saying, to sacrifice something in the short term for the long term?
Well, I think the answer to that is a question of political will and public opinion at the same time. I think if recent events, as they're unfolding, even in Ukraine, if I can draw an analogy there, show that what we may have thought was an impossibility just a few days, if not weeks ago, is now very real. And in the same way, it's our ability to imagine something as a different approach, a different outcome, that will enable us to think about whether we can solve that problem. So I think there is a willingness on the part of many governments, on the part of many consumers, and on the part of many businesses to say there is a cost, but it's an investment in the opportunity for a better system of managing our economies and societies. That is worth paying now, because the price will be higher the longer we wait. Mm-hmm. The costs will go up. The costs will go up environmentally. We see the IPCC report again underlined how those costs will increase the longer we wait. The price of some of these new technologies, the new models of doing business, will inevitably come down the more they are scaled, the more they are deployed, and therefore we will see an inflection point. But we're at this is now a very difficult moment, because we've done some of the easy, low-hanging fruit has been picked, if you want, in terms of some of the energy efficiency improvements, some of the emissions reductions, some changes to our lives and to businesses can be relatively easily undertaken. Now we're having to make hard choices. So the ambassador, again, is absolutely right. These are not trivial, insignificant choices that are being made now and will have to continue to be made. But I do think that they are ones that we should be wary of judging in terms of short-term cost in a narrowly economic way, even if they are significant, given the longer-term benefits, which are not just economic, mm-hmm. but which will also be economic. And I think a lot of the work that I'm doing with Cambridge is looking at how to understand better what the way to make those opportunities not just come to life, but be competitive from a European perspective.
So can you give us some examples, some concrete examples, some good practices that you have observed with your work? If you also have something maybe from Hungary or from the region, so that also the audience can learn something concrete today.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this didn't start yesterday, and there are examples, if we go back sort of 20 or 30 years, of countries who invested in technologies and industrial infrastructure and provided seed funding, research, innovation funding, who have seen parts of their economy blossom. A sort of poster child, in a way, for this would be wind energy in Denmark. But that was an investment and an approach that they decided on decades ago, actually. In more recent times, there is a lot of economic benefit now from heat pumps, for example, a technology that in Europe and indeed in Hungary is proving itself not just technologically but economically, and which is going to grow in demand. It's clearly an enormous part of the solution to household heating. So there are examples, I guess, of more recent as well as longer-term investment strategies that have produced ecosystems of companies, universities, research institutes, and financiers helping to develop a chain, if you want, that goes from startups working with multinationals, because very often these work hand in hand, to develop those and to scale them, and indeed then make a success at deployment. And I think the deployment is going to be crucial in this, because that's where obviously the businesses who are deploying them will make the money.
And how is the Fit for 55 package helping all of this?
Well, some would say it's basically part of an industrial strategy. It's designed to create demand for many of these new products and services to deliver on the outcomes. So it's an exercise in demand creation in the European market. If that succeeds, it should enable, and it needs to go alongside, one of the components I should add, is sustainable finance, more broadly defined. I know we have a colleague here from MSCI who no doubt will be able to talk about that a lot more as well. But how the sustainable finance agenda enables investors, shareholders, to make decisions about investment into European countries and companies operating in Europe is crucial for that to work. But if that does lead to that investment into Europe, then we should see the scaling of the production and the distribution and the deployment of that happening first in European countries, but potentially with an export potential or a deployment potential in the global markets that will likely follow. Not in every case, but many of the solutions that we're talking about in Europe here will be necessary in other parts of the world in the near future, if not obviously by 2050. There are only so many ways to decarbonize industry, energy, agriculture, transport, and so on.
Yeah, maybe there are some countries not in the European Union that have much more potential. So do you think there is a future for the Fit for 55 or financial aids from the EU to investments from the EU actually to other countries?
I think that's exactly the point. Competitive sustainability does not mean you try to do everything and to be the world leader in every one of those technologies and solutions. There are clearly areas where other parts of the world, with their own industrial strategies, and you can look at the US and China just as two examples, but there are many others, where there are companies and there are government support schemes that will enable them to be more competitive in the short or the medium or long term, and where there is therefore a choice to be made by the European Union as to whether those are the most important areas to invest and to scale and to lead on. So this has to be well judged from that point of view. And it's where a lot of the...
What about technology? Because if we take, for example, the patents that are registered in some countries, and maybe they are closed patents, then this is, again, it's not cooperation.
No, and this is where there's a distinction between the aspect of collaborative sustainability and competitive sustainability. Some patents, some research and innovation activity is clearly necessary and best undertaken through global collaborative efforts, and there are a number which are underway. Mission innovation, in a broad sense, is exactly that. But then there are other areas where, of course, when the market dynamic is able to work at its best, you will see those being taken from an idea and an early stage research project to startup and scaling that can be best undertaken in certain parts of the world because of the infrastructure and the ecosystem, if you want, the industrial ecosystem that lies around them. And to that extent, I think as well, a key element of the possible success of the European Union's approach to this is the transition pathways that DG GROW, or the industrial strategy that the European Commission is thinking through, will also have to focus on as well, where many of these difficult choices will come home to roost as well.
Going back to the Fit for 55, Mr. Ambassador was mentioning before some paths like key areas, greenhouse gases reductions, energy efficiency, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the ETS. What do you think are the holes, if we can call them like that, of the Fit for 55? Yeah. And I know that you're going to have then a session entirely dedicated on circular economy, so I don't want you to spoiler everything for the audience. But if you can give us just a preview of that.
Well, I mean, there's an obvious connection that needs to be made with the other area the European Commission and the European Union is working on, namely the circular economy. They're not sufficiently integrated and connected yet, even if there is a large amount of work on both. And from the perspective of climate, at the very least, much greater progress on circular economy measures has obvious emissions benefits, if you want, greenhouse gas emissions benefits. That is one area that I think needs to be pursued more. There are certainly more areas of new technology that can be pursued more. Some of them are very energy related, but some are industry related. An area that many of us have probably worked on over the years is carbon capture and storage. This is something that is obviously going to be a necessary part of the mix overall. Has not yet succeeded, if you want, in terms of having necessary support, infrastructure development, and so on, but has challenges because of the fact that it is obviously a big cost that comes at the end of another system, and needs to be weighed up against all the alternatives for emissions reduction. But it's inevitable that we will need some.
So what about heavy industries like steel, cement?
And I think that's a great example of how, if I were to go back 5 or 10 years, the discussion with the cement industry, for example, the assumption was either there is almost no way we could get to zero emissions, or the only way we can do it is with enormous quantities of CCS. You cast forwards now, and while CCS is still going to be an important part of that, the technologies that have been evolved by many of the companies who are working in this sector and others demonstrate that actually there's a huge emissions reduction potential even before you turn to CCS, including actually circular economy solutions. So the amount that we will need to deploy CCS will depend to a large extent on how successful we are in creating the solutions, not just for cement, but that's a key area, but in other areas too. So you mentioned steel and chemicals, similar dynamics, but very different technologies in play there. And indeed, steel, we now see companies making zero emissions steel with no need for CCS in the end. But the volume that we have of steel production means that may not yet be possible to scale quickly enough across the world to be a total answer.
It's all a question of magnitude here.
There is a question of magnitude. It's a magnitude and speed question. Yeah.
And also another thing that the Mr. Ambassador was saying, that he's expecting some dramatic changes this year for the Fit for 55. What do you expect?
dramatic
or
changes.
hope to expect at
yes,
least.
well, this is where, I mean, I absolutely have sympathy with him in the difficulty of negotiations around this issue right now, particularly given the new context that is inevitably facing all the negotiators, every business that's dealing with it, every parliamentarian. This is hugely challenging to do quickly. And there is certainly an argument that less haste, more speed. So to reflect and make sure we take the right decisions now is absolutely crucial if we're going to be in the right place in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So I think big changes, I think in a way it's more that there needs to be time to digest all of the challenges, some of which he mentioned, some of which are newer, because the package isn't the whole answer to all of those questions, but it's a big part of the answer to some of them. So I'm not sure that there will be big changes immediately, but in many of the adjacent policies, I'm sure there will be other changes. And I think, yeah, I mean, we will need to take time to reflect. Some of the, he mentioned as well that there is a constituency in the scientific world, in the NGO world, who are saying not slow down and be more cautious, but they're saying speed up and be more ambitious. The extrapolation of the Paris Agreement timetable for 1.5 degrees achievement suggests that if the EU wants to lead, it needs to be even more ambitious than it is now. But then we're in the same space, as he quite rightly mentioned, of implementation. How do you do this? How do you fund it? Is that possible immediately or not? So we come back with the same set of challenges. My strong sense is that as long as we keep the perspective that the challenges are matched by an opportunity, and I think from a business perspective that's particularly important, the new markets, the innovation that is going to drive and be driven by businesses is absolutely enormous. This is the biggest economic disruption that I have lived through, certainly, and coupled with the whole digital transition and the changes to business models and thinking that goes with that. Of course, there will be some losers and some businesses who will struggle in that. But there will be winners. There will be many winners, and there will, the balance, I think, is one that we need to keep in mind. This can be net positive from that point of view, whilst we are achieving net zero from an emissions perspective.
Well, I hope in the room there are just winners today. And I would like to ask now to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have any questions to Martin. He's here for one day only, so you should take it this time to make questions. I think that there are microphones around also. So, okay,
I should say as well, I am staying for the circular economy discussion, and I can be contacted, like the ambassador, after the meeting. So.
We have a question there.
Okay, so hello, I'm Levente Shuba from K&H Bank, responsible for sustainability there. And I would have rather a remark, and I'm looking for your opinion on this. And my remark would be for these EU sustainability policies altogether, that my feeling after dealing with this topic since a year, roughly, that a lot of effort and attention is put on policy making and dealing with a lot of things at once, from steel, cement, housing, energy, transport, cars, agriculture, whatever. So we want to solve everything at once with the best possible intention on the policy level. And my feeling is that maybe we would have more success if we would rather concentrate on the most important areas where we already see a solution. For example, we don't really see the perfect solution now for the road freight transport, but we rather see the solution for the renewable energy and housing issues, which have a big impact. And of course, we see some solutions there, but I sense that the energy put into the translation of these policies into everyday life of people and companies, SMEs, even bigger companies, is not that much there. So more incentives, more penalties, more roadmaps understandable for everyday people, for companies. So more translation into real life. What is your opinion about this?
Well, I think it's absolutely the case that there's a risk if you go into too much detail on every single area that is necessary to take on, that you get lost in the weeds, essentially, and that it becomes counterproductive. I think at the same time, part of the exercise of going into the weeds is also about creating this demand and market rules that will pull through solutions. And in many cases, we have a complex regulatory system where those rules are already set and they need to be changed in order to set the right incentives. So there's an unavoidable need to go into some detail at certain points, and that's where the arguments will very often happen. At the same time, I think you're absolutely right that there are always going to be choices about where you have the biggest impact in the shortest time, and maybe you should focus on those, as well as having broader signals, such as the carbon price, which will affect everyone in principle over time. The balance between those two is clearly, going to be a matter of judgment, and I can only say that I think, given that the attempt is to enable a transition of our entire economy and society, that I understand why there is a temptation to go in to look at every aspect of the problem. I think for the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package as a whole, the risks that some of the Commission officials saw when they were presenting it from the negotiation process was that they had tried to think of an integrated package that works only if you do everything, because if you unpick one part, it may undermine other elements of it. And the challenge with that is, of course, that one part of it may not be perfect and may need to be adjusted, but then you have to look at the implications and the repercussions on other parts of that package. So it's a delicate balance between keeping the integrity of the overall approach and ensuring that you can have detailed discussions and change parts of the package where that is going to be necessary. But I think the overall approach that I would say that we're moving towards now is that we've put a lot of emphasis through regulations as well on regulating the supply side of the economy, essentially. Producers have had a huge amount of regulatory attention on them. And in broad terms, and this also applies to the circular economy, I think there will be more attention and hopefully more benefit from creating demand, as long as that's not too narrowly defined for a very small category or range of technology solutions, then that should open up business opportunity and require less sort of detailed intervention, as long as the demand can be created at a broad enough level to also achieve the outcomes. And I think that shift from supply side to demand side policy making, in principle, is going to be beneficial for businesses, because it should reduce the extent to which there will be exclusively supply side or producer focused regulation and policy.
Is there any other question from the audience? Okay, there is one there. And yeah, there.
Peter Ciuczka, Lexmark Competence Center. My question is about, it's not once that we have seen that immediate and more pressing priorities are overshadowing the important ones. What would be your assessment of the geopolitical challenges outshadowing the Green Deal effort? Do you see such a risk? And if yes, how could that be managed? Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
So I couldn't work out whether you were saying about the immediate challenge or just the broad context. Was that specifically over the immediate?
No, my question is more generic. I tried to pick a specific example because that's what we all could relate to. But generally speaking, there will always be something that's more urgent,
Yep.
and the climate challenge will not go away. How high do you see the risk of immediate priorities outshadowing the long-term ones?
Yeah.
And what we as AmCham members could do to help with that? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think in the very short term, I think it's absolutely right, as well as inevitable, that there is a political focus and immediate attention on what is happening in Ukraine. At the same time, I think if I were to go back 10 years or 15 years and other shocks that we have gone through economically or in health terms, in terms of COVID in the past couple of years.
But we don't have the time for that. So.
No. But the lesson would be, if you go back 10 or more years, the response to a crisis was to move away from the sustainability agenda and to focus on the short-term recovery and almost sort of sideline it. What we have seen in the response to COVID has not been that. And actually, many of the recovery packages, the support programs, and indeed the political attention, not just in Brussels and elsewhere, has been centrally sustained because they have to be answered together. They can't be disaggregated and separately responded to. So I think that's a positive. And one reason for that, I think, is that there is a broader and greater appreciation from businesses, including, I think, in this room, obviously, as well, that there is not just a need for these changes because the economy will work better in the end if we do answer them correctly, but that businesses clearly have a voice. Politicians listen to them. They have customers. You play an important role in reassuring politicians and policymakers that they are doing the right thing by sustaining their attention on this as a central part of economic and political strategy. I think sustainability has become a fundamental economic, political issue. It's not an environmental issue somewhere out there to be considered as an afterthought. It's not a social issue that is somehow dealt with separately. It is integral to the way we approach our economic strategy and our geopolitical strategy from that point of view as well. So my sense actually is that, and we see some signs of it even in the last sort of few days, that there won't be a shift away from the centrality of this agenda, certainly in the European Union, because of what we are witnessing unfold in Ukraine. It does not mean it will not challenge it, and obviously attention needs to very immediately shift. But I think it will remain a North Star, if you want, for the medium and long term for the European Union. Strategically, it makes no sense to drop this strategy when we know it will get more difficult to solve, more expensive, as we've just heard, if we do that. Every way round, I've been in many discussions, obviously, like this over the years, and you always come back to the same point. You're better off grappling with the problem immediately, trying to see how you can solve it as well as possible over the long term, but not pushing it into the future. We've done that, frankly, far too long. And we will now, I think, hopefully learn an important lesson, actually, another one from recent events, that an inadequate response that doesn't deal with an issue will lead to it becoming worse, and much worse, 8-10 years later. So I hope that we can learn that lesson now.
We do have, I think, one last question, because I've seen a gentleman from there. You're okay? Okay. Well, then, thank you, Martin, for this interesting and insightful discussion. And I really wish the audience and all the businessmen here to be competitive but sustainably. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck. Thank you as well.
Thank you.